On today's, on the other hand, we talk with someone working to help Arkansans come together in making our state better. Here's a sneak preview.
If you believe in democracy as a citizen of the United States, then democracy requires participation.
This is On the Other Hand. A podcast sponsored by Braver Angels in Arkansas. In this podcast, we explore politics and other issues of importance to Arkansans. We do this through having conversations with community leaders. So stay with us as we talk to another leader in Arkansas who works across differences to get things done and to bring us closer together. Hello and welcome to On the Other Hand. I'm your host, April Chatham Carpenter, and I'm here today with my co-host, Glenn White. And on our podcast, Glenn and I often interview community leaders in Arkansas who help work towards solutions across various political or other divides, or who in other ways reach across various divisions within our community. And Glenn, I'm very excited about our guest today. So tell us who we have.
Yeah, April, we're real happy to have Shana Chaplin join us in our conversation. Shana is Chief Program Officer of the Rockefeller Institute, and she's up there on the mountain in Impediments. She has expertise in civic engagement, I understand, which is helpful for what she's doing. She's served 35 years in the public sector as a community engagement professional, and part of that was a stint as director of Engage Arkansas. Right now, she serves on the Pulaski County Homeless Village Advisory Board, and she was recently named one of Arkansas's 250 most influential leaders by Arkansas Business Publishing Group. So, welcome to On the Other Hand, Shana.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
We're happy to have you. Let's start off by just letting you tell us a little bit about who you are. Give us a brief bio. Who are you? What do you do? And other than what I just mentioned, and what else you want us to know about you?
Okay, sure. I'm Shana Chaplin. I do serve as Chief Program Officer at the Rockefeller Institute. I have been there just a little over a year. And as part of that, one of our premier programs is Civic Arkansas. I have been in the community for, now a little over 45 years. But I think one of the things a lot of people don't know about me, but I think significantly influences my work, especially in this space of Civic Arkansas, is I grew up overseas. So my family's from Arkansas, but I didn't grow up in Arkansas. And so I lived all the way up through graduating from high school overseas. And I think attending international schools and being a part of a international community really influenced sort of my worldview, also influenced my understanding of civic engagement. I had the opportunity to be around a lot of worldwide nonprofit organizations, embassy people, State Department. So I think that as I've gotten older, I've realized more and more how that's influenced sort of my viewpoint and my willingness to look at things from multiple ways and have dialogue and not be scared of things that are different from me or my culture or my values.
Well, that's nice to hear. Yeah, having that sort of cultural diversity and exposure to different things is really valuable. That's interesting to hear you have that background.
Yeah.
So how did you said you've been with the Rockefeller Institute for just about a year. What led you to join up with the Rockefeller Institute?
Well, goodness. I had previously been director of Engage Arkansas, which is the Governor's Commission on National Service and Volunteerism. That office historically had been what Arkansas used to call the Division of Volunteerism in the state. And in that work especially, I had partnered with the Institute on a number of things, utilizing their facilitation services. Marta Lloyd and I had established sort of a relationship, getting to know one another, talking about nonprofit issues. And then as we began to look at, as a collaborative group, the Clinton School with the Rockefeller Institute, Engage Arkansas, Central Arkansas Library System, I began to look at an opportunity to publish the first Civic Health Index. It became sort of apparent that the best place for any work post the publishing of the Civic Health Index, to live seemed most appropriate at the Winthrop Rockefeller Institute. And so as we began to talk about that, I was in the midst of transition. Anyway, I had stepped down from a position at Engage Arkansas and was contemplating sort of my next opportunity. And this opened up and became a great opportunity and gave me the chance to also continue some work that I had been doing in another space, but doing it from a little bit different lens.
It's interesting, the part about Engage Arkansas, that it used to be called the Department or Division of Volunteerism. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, that's interesting. It makes me a little bit jealous of your ability to know how to get people to volunteer. We could really use that in Braver Angels. So if we had money, we would, hire you as a consultant.
I cracked that code.
Okay. Well, anyway, so you've mentioned this already. We're going to get into a little bit about the Civic Arkansas initiative. As you know, I first met you along with some other of our Braver Angels when we, along with many other Arkansans, attended the initial meeting of the Rockefeller Institute Civic Arkansas initiative. So you'd kind of mentioned something about some of the problems there with, engagement and civic health not being good in Arkansas. So tell us a little bit more about civic engagement. What is it? Why is it important? And what's Civic Arkansas doing about it?
Okay. Civic engagement is broader than volunteerism, and I think that's important for everyone to understand. It's sort of volunteerism is often the first thing we think about, but it's just sort of a small piece of the pie. At the Institute, we also like to talk about that there's sort of this continuum of citizenship, of different levels of citizens getting involved in their community. And so I define civic engagement simply as that. It's just citizens being informed and involved in their community. And that can be something as simple as just being informed, reading, attending meetings, no real action necessarily being taken, to volunteering, to maybe serving in an elected position, all the way to voting, and being deeply embedded in community processes. So that's sort of the continuum we like to talk about. And Arkansas had never had a civic health index done, and the civic health of a community is all dependent upon those various aspects of civic engagement. So the tool really sort of assessed that. And I don't know that it surprised any of us that are in this space. Glenn, you mentioned it's, everybody struggles to get people to volunteer. Volunteerism has been on the decline steadily in our country. No different here in Arkansas. And so things like that are, important to the health of a community. And we wanted to really look at that data, which we had never had those sort of hard numbers on. The information is pulled from the census at the national level. So we also partnered with the National Conference on Citizenship. Some of the information was pulled from state and regional data, and then we also had interviews conducted. So overall, Arkansas civic health is not great. Everything from its volunteerism rate to trust in media, to trust in government, to voter engagement, but both registration and actually voting is poor. We're 51st in the nation in that. But one of the things that stood out to us was we were very high in social connectedness. And that was a new measure that is just now sort of really being fleshed out nationwide, but really looking at the value that people place on a desire to help and know their neighbors. And Arkansas ranked very high in that. So for me and for us at the Institute, as we looked at that, because we're conveners, we also try to get people to collaborate. What that said to me was that there's a value still held by Arkansans that if they maybe knew the pathway, or if they had the information, the support, the training, the equipping, they do have a value of wanting to come alongside neighbors and work to support neighbors, to help one another. So for me, that's sort of the golden nugget in the index. I think the challenge for us then, for organizations like Braver Angels, for us, for Engage Arkansas, for any number of groups, then is how do we get people to act on that value? What's holding them back from acting on that value? So we went around the state. We went to about 29 communities doing listening sessions, both with community members of all ages and collegiate students. To ask them that, to sort of dig into some of the data. What are the barriers? Does this data resonate with you? Does it make sense? Do you see this in your community? What are your values? And in that space, we saw three themes really emerge. One, most people did resonate with the fact that, yes, they want to get involved. What we heard sort of in the back conversation as we facilitated was just really kind of an overwhelm, almost a sense of too much information, too many places to look for information, not knowing for sure when things are happening, the pathway to get involved if they want to get involved in local community. Sometimes being fearful to do it because they don't want to do it by themselves and not being aware of others who have the same interest. And so we did feel like we did hear that people have that desire. They're just, again, some roadblocks. Some of it is apathy. Some of it is sort of like, I'm tired of the national rhetoric. I'm tired of the state rhetoric. I wish our local voice was louder. That was a clear message we got. So again, as we move forward, we kind of broke down three themes that we saw emerge in every community. And these three themes were the same in our collegiate listening sessions. We thought they might be different for that age group, but they weren't. And so those three themes were, one, just a recognition that people have lost civic understanding, and they want more civic education. People admitting and owning that, they don't know what their local government does versus what their state government does. They're not aware who takes care of water or sewer system versus who takes care of roads, things like that. And so just a desire to have more education. And that's where I think, partnership with people like you all, Braver Angels, is helpful because that's a big part of what you do in your dialogues is you're helping to educate people around those spaces. Then we also heard lack of civic spaces themselves. So this idea that community wants to be connected, but there's no place to do that. There's not, we've seen community centers get unfunded in local communities. We know currently there are a lot of issues around libraries and defunding of libraries. And so a lot of the spaces that have historically been those civic spaces where people could connect, they could come together, do something for their community, or just a place where you're meeting other communities and having dialogue, was on the decline. And so that's something we are going to kind of step back from and really assess. We have a partnership with the Municipal League. So we're going to do some assessment through mayors of what does exist out there, what doesn't. I don't know that we have a good sense of that, even around things like senior centers, right? And we know that some of that funding has been impacted recently, Meals on Wheels, things like that. Again, places where people connect and gather. And then trusted media, trusted news sources was a really big issue with everyone. But interestingly, it wasn't just a request for help us figure out what's true and what's not. It was more about a desire to have local newspapers back. Now, whether that's print or that's online, we didn't get into that, but even among young people, just a sense of if it was a local driven newspaper that told me my local news, I would have more information. I would trust it more. So we'll be working with the Press Association and a couple of other organizations trying to host a convening around that topic. What does that look like? And I think the question back to the public post that information is, what is it worth to you? Part of why newspapers have declined is lack of funding, lack of advertising in communities that are losing businesses, downtowns shutting down. But we also heard from community, I would pay for it, but what I would pay for right now is a local newspaper that's published by a national conglomerate.
Mm-hmm.
So there's still no local news in my local newspaper. I'm getting, national news, regurgitated. So I think there are things like that to think about. I don't think we can jump to an assumption that people won't pay for it. I think we also have to look at what's happened in the process. What are people currently getting and what shifts need to be made and how can we? And there are a lot of interesting things happening across the country, nonprofit newspapers emerging. There's some programs around where you actually train and support local citizens to do some report gathering and then submit that to an actual journalist. So we'll be talking about those things as well moving forward. But those were three themes that were very strong across every community. And so we felt like that was a good place to start.
Okay, thank you. There is, before we move on to April, I wanted to ask kind of a lot of us may not be entirely sure about this term civic engagement, all it means. You've mentioned a couple things, like voting or just reading and being aware of things. But can you give us some specific example of things a person might do that means, oh, I'm being civically engaged? What might that look like on the ground?
Yeah. And one, I will give just a plug. If you go to our website, we launched a civic commitment this year, which is 12 months of activities that are all civic engagement activities. So a citizen can go on our website, they can print that off, or they can just go to the website each month and kind of check on those. But it's everything from as simple as, if you don't know who your city council person is, find out who your city council person is and have coffee with them. Get to know them. It's attend a school board meeting. You may not say anything. You may or may not have children in the school district, but attend a school board meeting just to see, what does that look like? Begin to have an understanding of who those people are. What kind of decisions are they making? It can also be go volunteer. If there's a cleanup initiative in your community, if there's a city or county, celebration or Martin Luther King parade or those sorts of things, get involved in that, begin to meet people there. And then it is as simple as, if you're not currently reading a newspaper, or if you're not currently getting information from your city or your county, see if there's something you can register for to kind of get those alerts or those notices, to simply be aware of when things are happening, or begin to educate yourself about the issues in your community.
Yeah. So that includes things like getting involved in civic groups and organizations like,
Sure.
Rotary and
Rotary,
or maybe your church or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
As you were talking, and the whole idea of the need for civic engagement reminded me of Robert Putnam's work. In 2000, he wrote this book looking at the history of our kind of civic engagement, and called Bowling Alone. New documentary came out recently, I think, Join or Die, with him and some other people.
Yeah.
But, last year, the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, declared a national loneliness and social isolation epidemic throughout the country. That very likely could have been coming off of the heels of COVID, right? And my students I know talk about that, and how even, education systems and their experience in high schools as they were coming into college were experienced by that. But Putnam argues that we're lonely because we're not involved in our communities, and kind of the historical, connection to that. So, and other people argue that our digital age is making us lonely. We see the Instagram posts, the Facebook post of these people look like they're having wonderful lives because they post about what their wonderful what they want people to think about them, but they may be really lonely inside. And so I think about the isolating tendencies of our culture that we have. And I'm curious about kind of going back a step and thinking about why civic engagement is important. So important for me personally. So I'd like for you to answer that first, and then important also for the health of a community.
Sure. I do think on some level, civic engagement, which I see as strongly tied to citizenship, and I think that's not unique to America. I think you see that when you live in other countries. Everyone has an idea of citizenship and some responsibility in that space. And I think in America specifically, I do think we have sort of seen a decline of valuing that, of appreciating that we do have a duty, and we have a collective duty. And I think it's always been challenging for us in this country to balance sort of that American independence, that, pursue the American dream, individual rights. We have a lot of freedoms that many countries don't experience, which is wonderful, right? It's what makes us this unique country. But I think we have always struggled with balancing those individual rights with collective good. And my sense is that somewhere along the way, and I don't know where, I'm not a sociologist or but I sense that somewhere along the way, individual rights sort of began to be way more important than collective good. And then I think you begin to have this increasing divisiveness across parties, and politics became much more about parties than policies. And you just sort of furthered that then. But I think why it's important, if you believe in democracy, as a citizen of the United States, then democracy requires participation. I mean, there's just no question about that. But I think for us as professionals in the field to think that we can move people from isolation, very little engagement in community, to voting is just it's not possible. It's not feasible. Or we also need to own that if we do that, we're moving people probably to a misinformed vote. Because the reality is we will not fully understand the issues we're voting on. We won't know the role the people are going to play that we're voting for if we haven't been involved in community. That's where you really learn. So I can take civics, I can take American government, I can hear about the homeless issue, for example, in my community. But until I engage either with a homeless person that I build a connection with, or I go work at the food pantry at my church and begin distributing food, or I go to the homeless shelter to organize the clothes closet, whatever it may be, those are those civic spaces where we then begin to connect on those issues, seeing the humanity of the other person. And I think that's a part of what we've lost in this social isolation that exists for whatever reasons. And I think it's all of the things that you mentioned, April. We've lost humanity. We don't see each other. We see each other as icons on a screen, or we see each other as the person that lives down the street, or we see each other as some other label, the other party, the other this, lives on the other side of community. And these labels become heavier, and we lose that understanding that we are probably not that different. When I sit across from, someone that's homeless as a result of maybe addiction, you begin to realize, the reality can set in that we're all maybe one step away from that. We're maybe one surgery and one prescribed pain medication away from becoming addicted. and then losing everything as a result of that. And so I think that's it to me. That's the biggest challenge we face, I think, in Civic Arkansas is as we try to seek to move people from that value of social connectedness, from being in isolation to how do we help people see each other in their humanity so that they are more open to dialogue, learning, and then beginning to engage. I think right now there's also a level of fear, and I think some of that maybe comes out of COVID. I think some of that just comes out of this divisiveness, makes us think that if we engage with people who are not like us, that we're going to have to set aside our values. And I think, and that causes fear in a lot of people. I don't want to have to set aside, for example, my religious held values to work at the homeless shelter. But if you're telling me that, I might be standing next to somebody who's an atheist, I think those things get elevated in community and this fear gets created that we can't hold our values true for ourselves and still find commonality with other people and do good things in our community.
A lot of things there. I think initially when I was thinking about you coming on today, that I was imagining civic engagement as being an opportunity for me to engage in causes that I really felt strongly about, right? But oftentimes, if I'm engaging just in advocacy work, and certainly is a very important part of civic engagement, I oftentimes may be perpetuating that divisiveness, where I am not willing to work across the divide because I'm only working on my advocacy issue. Although I would argue that many times we have many people that are on various sides of things that can work on the same issue. But seeing the need to be involved and the social isolation helping us, getting away from that, helping us see the humanity of the other person is so important in the work that I know we do in Braver Angels. So low civic engagement, I'm thinking about, and in particular, I think we have a different, in Arkansas in particular, we have rural and urban communities. And I know that you all have been working in both of them in terms of getting information. I'm curious if you've had any different findings between the rural and urban in terms of civic engagement and the view of the importance of that. I know that wasn't one of the questions that we originally were planning to ask, but I was thinking about that as we were talking, because I think about living in Little Rock and doing some of the things that you're talking about. I'm like, oh yeah, well, my city council member, I'm like, well, I don't even know how to find that person, or who is it in a big city, in a rural area or in a smaller town. That's much easier to identify potentially. So I'm curious about rural urban findings that you all found.
I think we found on one hand many of the same issues, but also, some things are actually probably easier in rural community. People will often say to me, especially like around the community service requirement for students, oh, that's disproportionately unfair to rural students. I would argue the opposite. It's probably easier for a rural student. There may not be as many nonprofits or organizations to get involved with, but there are probably more opportunities to create service for yourself in a small community because it's easier to know people. It's easier to reach out, make that contact, do something. So I do think you have that. I think one of the things that happened that we heard the same across rural and metropolitan was just citizens being overwhelmed with information and places to find it. So, and I think that has a little bit come out of COVID. I think communities did a really good job during COVID, right? They had to figure out how to make meetings virtual. And then when they made them virtual, they realized, oh, well, we could open this up to the public and the public can log on and watch. Cities realized they needed to have more information on their websites, so they built websites. But again, what you find is often those are confusing. Unless you know what you're looking for, it's difficult to find it. Sometimes if you find it, there's no contact information. So it's like all these resources are out there, but they're maybe not complete, or they're still difficult. Or to find out what's happening in my community next weekend, I have to follow 5 different Facebook pages of the city, and I have to follow every nonprofit page, and I have to follow the chamber and the downtown partnership. And then I have to hope that with the algorithm, the event actually shows up on my feed before it's over. Like, we heard that over and over and over, whether we were in Little Rock or whether we were in Clinton, Arkansas. And I think on the one hand, cities and county governments and nonprofits have sort of patted themselves on the back that they all have social media platforms, they have all this stuff online, but they collectively haven't stopped to think about, what does that mean then for a citizen, to try to figure out, okay, if I wanted to participate in a citywide event this weekend, what is that event? Do I have to follow parks? Do I have to follow animal control? Do I have to follow, So I think there's just some work there, around how do you unify these things? How do we help citizens find a single source of information sometimes, which again is difficult. It's not really just resource directories. It's more sort of, again, a lot of people pointed to, if I had a local newspaper, all that would be in the newspaper, right? On Thursday. And I'd know when the football games were, I'd know when the weekend events were. So again, I think there's some gaps and things like that happening. But we did hear some things that in rural communities, I think there's less fear about getting involved. It's easier to know someone else that's involved in that issue. And so you're not as hesitant to kind of reach out to an organization or a person. Whereas in the city, you're not connected maybe individually to anybody. We also heard from college students just a true fear of engagement, that when they could engage, they were physically concerned about their safety in community. Was it physically safe to be at the homeless shelter after hours? Or they lived in a community where they didn't feel safe going out after dark. And that's when they have time available, maybe. So I think every community is going to have some unique challenges, but I think the universal theme we heard, again, even in rural community, is just how do I track all these things to know when something's happening and to know that I've not missed it.
Well, that's it, Glenn, for the first part of our conversation with Shana Chaplin. We'll continue our conversation with Shana in the next episode, so we hope our listeners will check that one out too.
Thanks for joining us on today's edition of On the Other Hand. This was the first part of our conversation with Shana Chaplin. Listeners with questions or suggestions for On the Other Hand can contact us via the podcast page of the Braver Angels Arkansas website at arkansas.braverangels.org. When there, you can also find links to all our conversations with our other guests. If you enjoyed this podcast or today's guest, check out the conversation we had with former government official and current Braver Angels Arkansas leader Ray Hanley in episodes 24 and 25.
On the Other Hand is sponsored by Braver Angels in Arkansas. Music was composed by Randall Standridge of Jonesboro, Arkansas, and was performed by the University of Northern Colorado Symphonic Band, Dr. Richard Main, conductor.
From your host, Glenn White
and April Chatham Carpenter.
Let's each do our part to bring our community closer together.